The Telshar Black Market was a place of shadows, where the faint starlight of the galaxy barely touched the corrupt deals that took place within. Hidden deep within a hollowed-out moon, this infamous hub was a crossroads of the galaxy's worst vices. Illicit technology, illegal substances, forbidden weapons, and the most despicable of all, living beings. Being stolen from distant worlds and sold to the highest bidder without a shred of dignity or mercy. Telshar was a place where hope went to die. Caden Riss didn't want to be here. He despised places like this. But he had long ago learned that in the dark corners of the galaxy, personal ideals were a luxury no one could afford. He was a man of pragmatism, a smuggler by trade, surviving by navigating the dangerous fringes of civilization. His business on Telshar was supposed to be simple: deliver a cargo of contraband medical supplies and get out. No complications, no moral dilemmas. Yet, something in the air felt different that day. As he walked through the crowded streets of the market, his dark jacket blending in with the throngs of interstellar criminals, traders, and mercenaries, Caden felt an unsettling pull. The usual cacophony of voices hawking their goods became a distant hum as something caught his attention: a raised platform ahead, where beings were being auctioned off like livestock. He had always avoided these auctions, disgusted by the spectacle. But for some reason, today, his feet carried him toward it. As the crowd gathered, pushing and shoving to get a better view, Caden found himself at the front, eyes locked on the stage. One by one, beings of various shapes and sizes were paraded across the platform. Some humanoid, others barely recognizable, all chained and broken. They stood there, hollow-eyed, their wills crushed by years of captivity. Caden clenched his jaw, willing himself to look away. This was the worst of the galaxy, and he had no intention of getting involved. Then she appeared. She was unlike any of the others, a strikingly beautiful figure with skin that shimmered faintly in the dim light like a ripple of water under the sun, shifting between shades of pale blue and silver. Her eyes, wide and defiant, glowed a deep violet, full of life, of fury. Her dark hair, streaked with silver strands, fell in waves down her back, and even in chains, she held her head high, refusing to be cowed by the sneers and jeers of the crowd. The auctioneer, a sleazy-looking alien with too many eyes and not enough conscience, stepped forward, addressing the audience with a booming voice. Next on the block. A rare treasure from the distant Sulphurus system. Behold, a member of a lost civilization, destroyed by war and raided for their riches. But this one is special. Caden's breath caught as the auctioneer continued, detailing her physical traits and potential uses like she was nothing more than a tool. But it was her eyes that held him in place. She wasn't like the others. There was still fight in her, a spark of something fierce, something defiant. Starting bid, 10,000 credits, the auctioneer called out. Hands immediately shot up around him, people shouting out numbers like it was some sort of game. Caden stood frozen, his mind racing. He should leave. This wasn't his business. He couldn't afford to get tangled up in something like this. He had no interest in owning a slave, no desire to become part of this sick system. But her eyes bore into him, as if silently pleading, daring him to act. Her gaze was both a cry for help and a challenge. She was trapped, but she refused to give up. Caden felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years, the urge to save someone. 20,000 credits, a voice shouted from his left. Caden turned to see a hulking brute of a man, covered in tattoos and scars, grinning as if he'd already won. 30,000, came another bid, this one from a woman in a lavish robe, her jeweled hands raised casually as if she were buying a piece of furniture. Caden's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stand the thought of her ending up in their hands. He had no idea what he was going to do with her if he did this, but he couldn't walk away. Not now. 50,000 credits. Caden's voice rang out before he could stop himself. A hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned in his direction. He felt the weight of 100 eyes on him, judging, scrutinizing. But none of that mattered, not when her gaze was fixed on him, the faintest flicker of hope in her eyes. The auctioneer, sensing the tension, leaned forward, his many eyes gleaming with greed. 50,000. Going once. Going twice. 70,000. The brutish man wasn't giving up so easily. Caden gritted his teeth. This was madness. He didn't have that kind of money to throw away. But then again, it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about her, standing there on that stage, vulnerable but unbroken. 100,000, Caden said, his voice calm but firm. The crowd murmured in surprise. No one had expected this scruffy Earth pilot to outbid the others. The brutish man cursed under his breath, but didn't raise the bid again. The auctioneer's voice was barely contained excitement as he called out the final words. Sold. To the Earthman for 100,000 credits. Caden's heart raced as the crowd dispersed. The transaction was swift, and before he could fully process what he'd done, the chains around her wrists were unlocked, and she was standing beside him. The reality of the situation hit him hard. He had just spent a fortune to buy a person who probably had no reason to trust him. She looked up at him, her violet eyes piercing through him as if searching for some hidden truth. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, though it was clear she was struggling with the unfamiliar language. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her tone a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Caden swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. Why had he saved her? He didn't know. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was pity, or maybe it was the fact that he couldn't stand seeing someone so full of life being crushed under the weight of chains. "I couldn't let them have you," he said simply. She didn't respond at first, studying him carefully, as if trying to decide whether or not she could trust him. Finally, she nodded, though the wariness in her eyes didn't fade. "My name is Arya," she said, her voice stronger now. Caden nodded in return. "I'm Caden. Let's get out of here before anyone changes their mind." With that, they walked together toward his ship, the horizon's edge, leaving behind the darkness of Telshar. But even as they stepped into the relative safety of his vessel, Caden couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than either of them had realized. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had just bought himself into, but one thing was certain: his life was about to change forever. Caden's ship, the Horizon's Edge, was a battered but reliable freighter, small enough to slip through the cracks of the galaxy's more watchful eyes, but fast enough to outrun most patrols. As the ship's engines hummed to life, the faint blue glow from the thrusters cut through the dark void of space, taking them far away from the twisted marketplace of Telshar. Caden sat at the cockpit controls, his fingers moving over the interface with practiced ease. His mind, however, was far from the routine of flight. In the co-pilot seat sat Arya, the alien woman he had just spent 100,000 credits to free. She was staring out into the stars, her violet eyes distant and unreadable. He stole a glance at her from the corner of his eye. The glow of the instrument panels cast soft shadows across her delicate features, highlighting the iridescent shimmer of her skin. Her presence was unsettling, though not in a threatening way. He had saved her on impulse, driven by a gut feeling that he hadn't fully understood. Now that the adrenaline was fading, the reality of the situation was sinking in. What was he supposed to do with her? He cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll find a safe place for you," he said, not looking at her directly. "Somewhere far from Telshar. You can start over, away from all of this." She didn't respond immediately. When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes weren't filled with gratitude. Instead, they held a sharp intelligence and a wariness that made Caden feel like he was the one under scrutiny. "And what then?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "After you drop me off, what happens to me? What happens to you?" Caden frowned. "I go back to my life. Smuggling jobs, mostly." "And you?" "Well, you're free to do whatever you want." Arya shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You risked yourself to save me. Why? You could have walked away. You could have done what everyone else did, pretended not to see. Her words struck a chord in him, but Caden wasn't ready to face whatever answer might be lurking beneath the surface of his actions. He had spent too long pushing down his emotions, surviving in a world where attachments and compassion were liabilities. This was no different, or at least, that's what he told himself. I don't know, he admitted finally, running a hand through his unkempt hair. I just couldn't watch them take you. I guess. I couldn't stand the thought of you ending up with someone like that guy who was bidding. Arya's expression softened, just slightly, but the tension between them remained. She turned back toward the stars, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't belong anywhere now. My planet. It's gone. My people. Gone. The slavers made sure of that. Caden's heart tightened in his chest at her words. He'd heard of entire planets being wiped out, civilizations erased by warlords and slavers alike. But hearing it from someone who had lived through it gave the tragedy a sharper edge. He realized, with a pang of guilt, that he didn't even know her story. He was about to ask when the proximity alert on the console beeped, drawing his attention to the screen. His stomach dropped. We've got company, he muttered, his voice tense. A squad of ships appeared on the scanner, closing in fast. Caden recognized the markings on the vessels immediately. They were Telshar enforcers. No doubt, they were coming to reclaim their property, and possibly make an example out of the man who had stolen from their auction. Arya leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the ships. They're not going to let me go, are they? No, Caden said, his jaw tightening. They're not. He quickly brought the ship around, punching the controls as he angled them toward the nearest asteroid field. It wasn't the best escape plan, but it was the only option. If they stayed in open space, the enforcers would catch up to them in minutes. The Horizon's edge shot forward, thrumming as its engines kicked into overdrive. The asteroids loomed ahead, jagged rocks floating silently in the vacuum of space. Caden weaved between them with practiced skill, narrowly avoiding collision as he pushed the ship to its limits. Behind them, the pursuing ships followed, their lasers firing in bursts of red light that cut through the darkness. The shots whizzed past the cockpit, some too close for comfort. Hang on! Caden shouted over the sound of the ship's groaning hull. Arya clutched the armrest of her seat, her eyes wide with alarm, though there was no sign of panic in her demeanor. Can we outrun them? I don't know, Caden grunted, twisting the controls to avoid a cluster of smaller rocks. I can lose them in the field, but we're outgunned. They've got more firepower than we do. Another volley of laser fire streaked past them, rocking the ship as it skimmed one of the asteroids. The shields held, but they wouldn't last much longer under this kind of assault. Caden's mind raced, searching for a way out. The enforcers were closing in. One of their ships had broken away from the others and was flanking them on the right. I need to take us deeper into the field, Caden said. But it's going to get rough. You'd better strap in. Arya nodded, securing her harness. But as she did, something changed in her expression. Her hands clenched the armrests tightly, and her eyes flickered with a strange, almost otherworldly light. Caden didn't notice at first, too focused on piloting, but then the ship's systems started acting strange. The controls flickered, and an odd hum vibrated through the hull. Caden's brow furrowed in confusion. What the hell dash? Before he could finish his sentence, an invisible wave of energy radiated outward from Arya. It wasn't something he could see, but he felt it, a pulse of raw power that seemed to ripple through the ship and beyond. Suddenly, the pursuing ships faltered. The closest enforcer's engine sputtered, and the ship veered off course, spinning out of control before colliding with a nearby asteroid. The others, still further back, slowed down as if caught in the same unseen force, their weapon systems flickering. Caden's eyes widened in disbelief. He glanced at Arya, who was breathing heavily, her hands glowing faintly. She looked as surprised as he was. What? "What did you just do?" he asked, his voice a mix of awe and confusion. I don't know," Arya replied, her voice shaky. "It just happened. I didn't mean to." Whatever it was, her power had given them the chance they needed. Caden didn't waste any time. With the enforcers thrown off course, he gunned the engines, guiding the ship deeper into the asteroid field and away from the danger. Minutes later, they had left the enforcers far behind. The ship coasted into a quieter section of space, the immediate threat gone. Caden let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They were safe. For now. He turned to Arya, who was still sitting quietly, her hands no longer glowing. The look on her face was one of confusion and fear, not fear of the enforcers, but of herself. Caden frowned, his mind reeling. What the hell was that back there? Arya shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. My people, we had abilities. Energy manipulation. But I've never done anything like that before." Caden leaned back in his seat, trying to process everything. This was more than he had bargained for. Not only had he saved her from the auction, but now it seemed she had powers that neither of them fully understood. Powers that could be dangerous. "You saved us," Caden said finally, his tone softening. Whatever it was, it worked. Arya didn't look convinced. She stared down at her hands, as if afraid of what they might do next. "What if I can't control it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Caden didn't have an answer. But something in him, something instinctual, told him that whatever happened, they were in this together now. He had saved her once, and now she had saved him. Their fates were intertwined, whether they liked it or not. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice firm but reassuring. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Together." For the first time since they met, Arya smiled, just a small, tentative smile, but it was enough. As the stars stretched out before them, Caden set a course for the unknown, knowing that the journey ahead was far from over. He didn't know where they would end up or what dangers lay ahead, but one thing was certain: his life had changed, and so had hers. And whatever the galaxy threw at them next, they would face it together. The escape was only the beginning. The horizon's edge drifted through the emptiness of space, a tiny speck against the vast, star-filled expanse. The tension from their escape had faded, but the weight of uncertainty hung between Caden and Arya like an invisible wall. They were safe for now, but both knew that the quiet wouldn't last. Days passed in a tense rhythm. Caden busied himself with repairs to the ship, patching up systems damaged during their flight from Telshar's enforcers. Arya kept to herself, her movements quiet and reserved, spending long hours sitting by the observation window, her violet eyes lost in the endless stars. Though they shared the same space, a fragile distance persisted, built from unspoken fears and questions neither of them were ready to ask. Caden found himself watching her more and more. Every time he glanced her way, he was struck by how alien yet how human she seemed. Her shimmering, almost translucent skin seemed to catch the light differently, but there was something achingly familiar about the sorrow in her eyes. He felt a tug of sympathy and something deeper he couldn't quite define. On the third day after their escape, the silence between them finally broke. Arya was in the cockpit, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the console, watching as the stars slipped by. Caden entered, hesitating at the door. He wasn't sure what to say, but the weight of the silence had become unbearable. "We've been drifting for a while now," he said, breaking the quiet. "I've got a few options for where we could go next, but I figured I should ask you." Arya didn't turn immediately, but her voice came softly, tinged with something Caden couldn't quite place. "It doesn't matter where we go. I have no home. Nowhere to return to." Her words hung in the air, heavy with loss. Caden stepped closer, leaning against the wall. "Silphira," he said quietly. "That's where you're from, right?" At the mention of her homeworld, Arya finally turned to face him. For a moment, Caden saw the pain she carried, the weight of her past reflected in her eyes. Yes, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Silphira was beautiful. We were a peaceful people. Scholars, healers, explorers. We lived in harmony with the energy of our planet. She paused, as if searching for the right words. We weren't prepared for war. The raiders came without warning. They tore through our cities, captured those of us who survived, and sold us like objects. Now, Silphira is just a memory. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and for the first time since they had met, Caden realized the depth of the trauma she carried. She wasn't just a refugee or an escaped prisoner. She was the last of her kind, or close to it. Everything she had ever known was gone, erased in the blink of an eye. I'm sorry, Caden said softly, not knowing what else to offer. I can't imagine what that's like. Arya's gaze softened, her expression turning thoughtful. You saved me from that auction, she said, as if still trying to puzzle out his motives. But why? You didn't know me. You had no reason to risk yourself. Caden shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. He had been asking himself that same question since the moment he'd placed the bid, but there wasn't an easy answer. He could have lied, made up some excuse, but something about her, about the way she looked at him, demanding honesty, made him tell the truth. I don't know why, he admitted. At least, not fully. I've spent most of my life looking the other way when things like that happen. You see too much of this stuff, people getting hurt, taking advantage of, and after a while, it gets easier to pretend it's not your problem. He paused, searching for the right words. But with you, I couldn't do that. I couldn't just walk away. Arya studied him for a long moment, her violet eyes searching his face as if trying to understand something deeper. I think you see yourself in me, she said quietly. Caden blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? You carry something, too, she said, her voice soft but certain. Maybe not like my loss, but you've been running from something. It's in your eyes. Her words struck a nerve. Caden opened his mouth to deny it, but the truth was too close to the surface. He had been running from his past, from the things he'd done, and the things he'd failed to do. He had never talked about it with anyone, certainly not with someone like Arya, but the way she looked at him made him feel like she already knew. He swallowed, leaning back in his seat and staring at the stars through the viewport. Maybe you're right, he said after a long pause. I've done some things I'm not proud of. Seen a lot of bad stuff. And yeah, maybe I've been running from it. But I'm not a hero, Arya. I'm not the guy who saves the day. I'm just trying to survive, like everyone else. She smiled faintly, a small, sad smile. And yet, you saved me. That makes you more of a hero than you realize. Caden let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. I don't think hero is the right word for what I did. Arya didn't push the point, but the silence that followed was no longer tense or uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like something had shifted between them, a fragile connection formed through shared understanding. They were two lost souls, adrift in a universe that had taken too much from both of them. As the conversation died down, Arya turned back to the stars, but her expression was less distant now, more present. Caden watched her for a moment longer before deciding to return to the task at hand. There's a place we could go, he said, breaking the silence again. It's a small planet, out of the way. I've got a few contacts there. It's not much, but it's safe. Arya nodded. I trust you. The simplicity of her words surprised him. Trust wasn't something people in his line of work gave freely or received. But she had said it without hesitation, and for the first time in a long while, Caden felt a flicker of something unexpected, responsibility. He wasn't just her rescuer anymore, he was the one she was depending on. They set a course for the planet Caden had mentioned, and as the days passed, the bond between them deepened. Caden found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't expected, sharing stories of his life on Earth, of how he had left after losing faith in his homeworld's politics and the greed that had spread through its core. Arya, in turn, shared more of her life before the raiders came, painting vivid pictures of Sulfur's landscapes and culture. One evening, after they had finished a simple meal in the ship's small galley, Caden found Arya sitting alone by the viewport, as she often did. This time, though, she wasn't lost in her own thoughts. She seemed to be waiting for him. "Do you miss Earth?" she asked, her voice breaking the quiet hum of the ship's systems. Caden hesitated, then shrugged. "Not really. There's not much there for me anymore. Not even people? Family?" A shadow passed over his face. "No. Not anymore." Arya seemed to sense the pain in his voice and didn't press further. Instead, she looked down at her hands, flexing them slightly as if testing their strength. I think I'm starting to understand my powers more. Back on Sulfura, we were trained to harness the energy of the universe, but it was always so controlled, so restrained. Now, it feels different. Stronger. Unpredictable." Caden watched her, his mind flashing back to the moment she had saved them from the Telshar enforcers. That pulse of energy had been nothing short of extraordinary, but it had also been dangerous. If she couldn't control it, they might face even more danger than they already had. "We'll figure it out," he said, echoing his earlier promise. "We'll find a way to help you control it." Arya looked up at him, her eyes shining with something that looked like hope. "You've already helped me more than you know, Caden. You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again." Caden raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Hope," she said softly. "And someone to trust." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the distance between them seemed to vanish entirely. There was something unspoken between them, an understanding, a connection that went beyond words. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They had become something more. In the quiet of that moment, Caden realized something he hadn't expected. He cared about Arya. Not just as someone he had saved, but as someone who had become important to him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The thought unsettled him, but it also made him feel more alive than he had in years. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, Caden felt like he wasn't facing it alone. Arya smiled at him, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Caden nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "You don't have to thank me." But as they sat together, side by side, watching the stars streak past, Caden knew that their bond had already changed both of them in ways neither could have predicted. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And somewhere deep inside, Caden realized that maybe just maybe Arya had saved him, too. The planet Ilvos, where Caden had decided to bring them, was as remote as they came, a forgotten world on the far edge of the Outer Rim. It wasn't much more than a collection of small settlements clustered around a sprawling desert, but its obscurity made it a safe haven for people like Caden, smugglers, outcasts, and those who had slipped through the cracks of the galaxy's powerful factions. The dense, reddish atmosphere gave the sky a constant twilight glow, casting long shadows over the rocky landscape. As the horizon's edge descended toward the dusty spaceport, Caden could feel the tension in his chest. This place had been a refuge for him in the past, but now everything felt different. He wasn't just running from trouble this time. He had someone with him, someone who depended on him. And that made him vulnerable in ways he wasn't used to. Arya stood beside him at the cockpit, her violet eyes scanning the dusty, rugged planet below. She was more composed now, more at peace, though the uncertainty of what lay ahead still showed in the tightness of her posture. "You sure about this place?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. Caden glanced at her, sensing the question beneath her words. "Will we be safe here?" "For now," he said, his tone reassuring. "Ilvos is a good place to lay low." The people here mind their own business, and I've got a few contacts who can help us. It's not glamorous, but it'll give us time to figure out our next move." Arya nodded, though her eyes remained distant. She had been quieter since their conversation about her powers, as if the weight of controlling her abilities and the loss of her home was growing heavier. Kaden could see it in her face, though she tried to hide it. Once they touched down on the cracked landing pad, Kaden powered down the ship's systems, and the two of them descended the ramp into the dry heat of the planet's surface. A warm, dusty wind swept through the port, and the familiar scent of sand and fuel filled the air. "Welcome to Ilvos," Kaden said, giving her a wry smile as he led her through the bustling port town. It was as much a frontier outpost as a proper settlement, buildings made from scavenged materials, small stalls selling everything from spare parts to exotic foods, and people from all corners of the galaxy walking the streets. Arya glanced around, her alien features drawing more than a few curious looks, but no one approached. This was a place where secrets were kept, and everyone knew not to ask too many questions. As they walked through the winding streets, Kaden led them to a small cantina tucked away behind a crumbling wall of metal and stone. It was dimly lit, filled with the murmur of hushed conversations and the clink of glasses. Kaden motioned for Arya to sit at a table in the corner while he went to the bar. The bartender, a grizzled old man with a cybernetic eye, gave Kaden a nod of recognition as he approached. "Haven't seen you around here in a while, Riss," the bartender said in a gravelly voice. "Thought you might have gotten yourself into trouble." Kaden smirked. "Trouble and I are old friends. You know that." The bartender let out a chuckle. "What brings you back to Ilvos? You here for business, or just hiding out?" "A bit of both," Kaden replied, lowering his voice. "I need to keep a low profile for a while. Got someone with me, she's, special. We had a run-in with the Telshar market, and I need to make sure we're off their radar." The bartender raised an eyebrow but didn't pry. "You know the rules here. Pay your docking fees, keep your head down, and no one will bother you." "That's the plan," Kaden said, slipping a few credits across the bar. "But if anyone comes looking for us, anyone from Telshar, I need to know." The bartender pocketed the credits with a nod. "You'll know if I hear anything." With that settled, Kaden returned to the table where Arya was waiting. She looked up as he sat down, her face unreadable. "Everything good?" she asked, though the question felt deeper than just the logistics. "Yeah. We'll be safe here for a while," Kaden reassured her. "I've got some contacts we can trust. We'll lay low, get some supplies, and figure out our next steps." Arya nodded, though her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of the glass in front of her. Her mind was clearly elsewhere. "I've been thinking," she said after a long pause, "about what happens next." Kaden frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I can't keep running," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "Not forever. And I don't want to live my life hiding in the shadows. The Telshar market is still out there, still enslaving others. And if I stay quiet, they'll never stop. Not just with me, but with everyone else." Kaden leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. He had sensed something like this was coming. Since the moment they escaped Telshar, he had known Arya wasn't the kind of person who would be content with running forever. She had too much fire in her, too much of a sense of justice. "You want to take them down," Kaden said, more of a statement than a question. Arya nodded. "Yes. Not just for me, but for all the others they've taken. My people. They're gone. But there are others like me, from other worlds. They need someone to stand up for them." Kaden let out a slow breath, his mind racing. Taking down Telshar was no small task. The market was backed by powerful crime syndicates, and its enforcers were ruthless. It would be dangerous, suicidal, even. But as he looked at Arya, he saw the determination in her eyes, the same defiance he had seen in her the day he'd bought her at the auction. She wasn't asking for his permission. She was telling him what she needed to do. And deep down, Caden knew he couldn't let her do it alone. "You're serious about this," he said, though he already knew the answer. "I have to be," Arya replied. "I can't live in fear anymore. And I won't let others suffer the same fate." Caden was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks, the dangers. But as he sat there, he realized something had changed in him, too. He had spent years drifting from one job to the next, never committing to anything, never getting involved in anyone else's fight. But with Arya, things were different. She had awoken something in him, something that had been buried for too long. The desire to stand for something, to fight for more than just his own survival. "All right," Caden said finally, leaning forward. "We'll do it. But we're going to need help. We can't take on Telshar alone." A faint smile tugged at Arya's lips. "I never expected to do this alone." Over the next few weeks, Caden and Arya began to gather allies. They reached out to Caden's old contacts, former smugglers, mercenaries, and freedom fighters who had their own reasons for wanting to see Telshar fall. Word spread quietly, and soon, a small but dedicated group formed. They were an unlikely band of rebels, but they had something powerful on their side, a shared hatred for the slavers and a cause worth fighting for. As they trained and planned in the shadowy backrooms of Ilvos, Arya's control over her abilities grew stronger. With Caden's encouragement, she learned to harness her energy manipulation powers with more precision, channeling the raw force she had used during their escape into something focused and controlled. It wasn't easy, but each day she grew more confident, more powerful. Caden, for his part, found himself stepping into a leadership role he hadn't anticipated. He had never seen himself as the kind of man to lead a rebellion, but Arya's faith in him, and the trust their new allies placed in him, gave him the strength to take on the responsibility. As the final pieces of their plan came together, the time for action drew near. Caden stood with Arya on the roof of a crumbling building overlooking the dusty town of Ilvos, the twin suns setting on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. "We're really doing this," Caden said, a hint of disbelief in his voice. Arya turned to him, her expression calm but determined. "We are." He met her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through, everything they had yet to face, settled between them. But there was no hesitation in her eyes. No fear. "Thank you," Arya said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "For believing in me. For standing by me." Caden reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I couldn't do it without you." Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the galaxy around them seemed to fall away. It was just the two of them, standing on the precipice of something bigger than either of them had imagined. The bond between them, forged in the fires of their shared struggle, had become something deeper, something unbreakable. And then, without a word, Arya leaned in and kissed him. It was soft, tentative, but filled with the weight of everything they had been through. Caden responded, his hand cupping her cheek as they stood together, bathed in the fading light of the setting suns. When they finally pulled apart, there were no words left to say. They didn't need them. Their futures were intertwined now, bound by more than just the fight ahead. They had found something in each other that they hadn't known they needed. A new future, built together. As the night settled over Ilvos, the two of them turned toward the horizon, ready to face whatever came next. Together.